Hi everyone, welcome. Today the plan is to check in on these two systems here. It's been 10 days since we last checked in on them, and at that time we predicted that that would probably be the last feeding that they get. And then the next phase would be to try to initiate the separation of the worms from the material that they're inhabiting so that that material can be harvested and that the worms can be, moved off to greener pastures, to a new home. So let's get these systems up on the bench and see if we're ready to get migration underway. I wonder if these systems over here that these two labels went on have already pretty much been harvested. The harvested castings are in here. We're just trying to see if we can bait stragglers out of there. But I'll tell you, that migration went so quickly that a first for me is that these little partition walls that I put in between the horizontal migration feeding zone and the finished castings survived. So if we make the decision to start horizontal migration in these systems today, I think we could just reuse these partition walls, set up a horizontal migration feeding zone, and let the process begin. Well, let's get them up on the bench and determine if that's really the next step. So let's get to work. Before we get our hands all dirty, let's just go over the stats for the systems. They're now 288 days of age, and it was up until day 199 that we were continuing to add bedding, and I believe that one of the last applications of bedding included leaves, because the sticking point with the material in these systems has been that the residue, the debris in the system, still seems to be pretty dominant. Like a lot of mainly stems of leaves, I believe. So I do have a sense though that we're probably going to find that we're ready to go to migration at this point. So in preparation for that, I've already taken some pretty good sized, larger chunks of material that we can use as the bedding to place into the horizontal migration feeding zones. And here's the little partition walls. Let's get to it and figure out if indeed we're ready to move ahead. So, right away you start seeing stems of leaves, but you got to also keep in mind the fact that if you were to just decide today that, hey, I want to just harvest these castings, move the worms on to a different place, and put these castings into storage as is, the material will definitely continue to break down. So, interesting. So even if you put it away with little bits of stuff in it, maybe not stuff quite as large as this or whatever here. It looks like the stem of a big pepper or something. I don't know. But yeah, as far as little things like the stems of leaves, I could certainly see these breaking down with the castings in storage. Or, it depends on your style. Maybe you'd really want the material to be really clean and you want to just let it go a little bit longer and forage a bit more until such a time that you really don't spot anything resembling sticks or stems. I really feel like I'm not totally locked in. We've got the partitions, we've got the bedding, I've even got food that's, definitely geared for the horizontal migration feeding zone setups, but I am prepared to just pull away from that idea if we decide that we might want to just let the systems forage a little bit longer. We would just feed them the coffee only and not the banana peels, and then just set all those other elements aside for the next check-in to see if maybe at that point we would want to proceed. I'll tell you one thing, I guess one of the reasons we switched over to the bubble wrap coverings last time, because up until then we were using those somewhat larger plastic bags to cover up, which really do cover almost the entire surface of the system, versus the bubble wrap sheets do leave a little bit of air around the edges. So like here I've disturbed things already, but here you can definitely see that stuff around the edges where the material was not covered up has gotten actually quite dry. And I think that was really intentional. We did feel like the material in these systems was still quite damp. And to me it seems like there's a couple variables that result in the worms migrating out of the material that they're in, either quickly or perhaps not so quickly. And it's partially making them feel a little bit uncomfortable, unfortunately, in the material that they're in, allowing that material to get a little bit drier. And that's going to result in somewhat lethargic worms, because they do breathe through their skins, absorbing oxygen from the moisture that they come in contact with. So if the material does start getting a little bit drier, then the worms might start sensing it. They'll also probably get a little skinnier in size. So you won't have big, fat, juicy worms full of moisture. You'll have worms that just haven't really had access to enough moisture to grow to that size. So they sort of scale back their body size, or I guess their body just, as a result of not having as much moisture at its disposal, ends up becoming a little bit smaller. So I do worry, though. I do worry about taking that to the extreme where the material's super dry and totally depleted of food, and the worms can barely even get out of their own way at that point just because they're barely surviving in this stuff. That's definitely not a good way to go. In the past, it always had been sort of allowing the material to get to that fineness stage, and a lot of times by the time we got the worms out of there, the poor worms looked like they were half dead, So I do sometimes feel like perhaps that's one of the areas of improvement that I could work on, in terms of not subjecting the worms to such terrible depletion of food supplies and moisture, access to moisture. A lot of people, separate the castings from material that's chock full of bedding and food and things like that, and just, perpetually skim off some of the accumulating castings and systems, which is something I've not really ever done. I've always kind of taken the material in a system to that point where I felt like it was a done deal, and then brought it to an end, So there's something about the material in both systems, I'll say, still too damp, I would say. That's just the sense that I get. It does feel to me like the moisture level's got to drop a little bit more before the worms would start seeking something more hospitable. I mean, I'm even thinking about, putting the plastic back on in such a way that perhaps doesn't rest all the way out, but maybe I put a big fold in the middle of it, like a little a camel's hump, and then allow at least the material on these outer edges to ventilate and dry a little bit, because I am starting to have second thoughts about initiating migration today. It just feels like it would not happen like it did in the other systems, where I would say 99.9% of the worms did evacuate the material, end up in the horizontal migration feeding zone, and that was after only 10 days. Here, it feels like if this material continues to stay this damp, the worms are just going to remain in it, and then the migration will just perpetuate, or perpetually take forever. It'll just not forever, literally, but take way longer than it needs to. So, you know what? I'm pulling the plug on the concept of migrating today. So these things, we could definitely use them, and I'll keep them associated to these systems, because I think that's exactly where we're going to end up using them. And I believe that these banana peels can go back into the refrigerator, back in the freezer, because I think all I'm going to do is I'm going to just give these worms this coffee. And that's going to be their feeding today. And I'm going to do it much the way we've been doing over the past many check-ins now. Not many, but at least a few, is trying to get the worms to not huddle in one place to go after the food that we're giving them, by like putting it down the middle in a trench the way we usually do. What I've been doing is spreading the food out a little bit more, so that in pursuit of the food, the worms will, kind of be grazing the entire system, not piling up in just one little feeding zone central to the system. So that's pretty cool. And you might have also noticed it's a little bit tough to see just the way it is here, but I did try to make sure I didn't spread the food all the way out to the edges, because if it gets dry out there, the worms are just not going to have much interest in going there for the food, and then the food will just sit there. I want the food to remain in a place that is covered with plastic, where there is going to be recirculating moisture, and that it gets eaten. It doesn't just sit here. That was the other weird thing I noticed when we first came in here. It seemed like there was a little bit of mold growing on whatever it is that we fed last time out on the surface. It was probably just coffee and worm chow. So they probably ate as much of it as they could, but it also seems like the mold got on it. And you know, I think just for the heck of it, just in case any of these worms really feel like they need some sort of a bedding type material into which they could sink their little teeth, I'm just going to leave them that. Leave them the feeding zone indicator, and I think we're just going to let it ride. We'll let it ride. Maybe another 10 days we'll come back, see if perhaps moisture levels have gotten to the point where we feel like worms in this material might be motivated to skedaddle and go in search of something nicer. And if we think that that is the case, then we'll set up that really nice feeding zone for them to migrate into, and in the meantime we'll just set up their plastic covers in such a way that hopefully the material starts to dry off a little bit. So we'll see how that goes. We'll just bring these in here, let this remain with the system. This is system number 1. It'll be on top when I stack them, so these should not be in the way. I think we're in good shape. So that's it for the check-in, everyone. We'll see how it goes next time. Maybe next time we'll start migration, but for now, at 288 days, we're still fed foraging. So that's it for the video, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.